There is a quiet moment, just before thought settles into certainty, when something feels slightly out of place. It is not loud enough to disturb, yet not soft enough to ignore. In that moment, a question emerges, almost reluctantly. What if the voice you call your own is not singular, but a fragile agreement between many voices that do not fully trust one another? This is where the philosophy of Marcus Aurelius begins to reveal its deeper tension, not in the clarity of reason, but in the subtle fracture beneath it. At first, the idea seems simple. We believe ourselves to be one person. We speak in a unified tone. We act with a sense of continuity. We remember yesterday as belonging to the same I that exists today. And yet, when attention turns inward with honesty, this unity begins to loosen. One part of the mind reaches for discipline, for virtue, for what is right. Another hesitates, resists, delays. At the same time, a quieter voice observes both, uncertain which one deserves allegiance. This is not a failure of character, but a condition of being human. Aurelius does not treat this division as an anomaly to be corrected once and for all. He returns to it repeatedly, as if circling something that cannot be resolved, only understood more gently over time. In his reflections, the self is not a stable structure, but a shifting field of impulses, judgments, and intentions. Reason is present, yes, but it is not alone. It must negotiate with fatigue, with desire, with fear, and so the inner life becomes less like a clear command and more like a quiet argument that never fully concludes. This leads to a deeper question. If the self is divided, then what does it mean to be free? Freedom, in the Stoic sense, is often described as mastery over oneself. But which self is doing the mastering? The one that seeks virtue, or the one that resists it? The tension here is subtle yet persistent. It suggests that freedom is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to remain present within it, not to silence the opposing voices, but to understand their place without being ruled by them. Yet something remains unclear. If awareness reveals this inner fracture, why does it not bring peace? One might expect that seeing oneself clearly would dissolve confusion, but Aurelius suggests the opposite. Awareness sharpens the contrast between what we aspire to be and what we find ourselves doing. It exposes the distance between intention and action, and in that space, a quiet discomfort grows. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady and undeniable. This discomfort has been echoed in other traditions, in other times. In the Confessions of Augustine of Hippo, there is the same recognition of a divided will. In the literature of Fyodor Dostoevsky, characters move through the world torn between opposing moral forces, unable to fully reconcile them. Even in modern psychology, the idea persists that the mind is not a single voice, but a collection of competing processes, each with its own logic. And still, Aurelius does not despair. He does not interpret this division as evidence of evil in a dramatic sense, but as a natural condition that invites careful attention. The presence of conflicting impulses does not negate the possibility of goodness. Instead, it defines the terrain on which goodness must be practiced. To act well is not to eliminate inner resistance, but to act despite it, or perhaps alongside it. At the same time, there is a quiet humility in this view. If the self is not fully unified, then certainty becomes softer, judgment becomes slower. One begins to see that others, too, are navigating their own inner contradictions. This does not excuse harm, but it reframes it. It places human behavior within a wider field of struggle, where intention and action do not always align. And so the crack in the self is not something to be sealed too quickly. It is something to be observed, returned to, lived with. It invites a different kind of patience, one that does not demand immediate resolution. The mind continues its quiet dialogue, sometimes clear, sometimes confused. The desire to be good remains, even when it falters. And somewhere within this ongoing movement, a deeper form of understanding begins to take shape, not as a final answer, but as a way of staying with the question a little longer. The weight of freedom. From the quiet recognition that the self is not entirely unified, another realization begins to unfold, slower and heavier, like a thought that does not wish to be fully seen. If there is no single, stable voice within us, then the act of choosing becomes more exposed, more fragile. And in this exposure, freedom appears, not as a simple power, but as a weight that settles into the center of one's life. In the reflections of Marcus Aurelius, freedom is not something to celebrate too quickly. It is something to approach with caution, almost with a quiet unease. At first, freedom seems like a release. To be free is to act according to reason, to align oneself with what is good, to remain unshaken by external events. This is the Stoic promise. And yet, at the same time, something within this promise begins to shift. Because if nothing external can truly determine our actions, then nothing external can excuse them either. The moment one accepts freedom in this sense, one also accepts responsibility in its fullest form. Every failure becomes one's own. Every compromise, every moment of weakness cannot be placed elsewhere. This leads to a deeper question. Do we truly want to be free in this way? Or do we prefer, quietly and without admitting it, to remain partially bound so that we may continue to explain ourselves through circumstance? It is easier, after all, to say that anger was caused by another, that fear was imposed by the world, that wrongdoing was shaped by necessity. But Aurelius gently removes these comforts. He does not deny that the world influences us, yet he insists that the final movement, the act itself, belongs to us alone. There is something unsettling in this insistence. It reveals that freedom is not only the ability to choose, but the impossibility of escape from one's own choosing. Even in hesitation, a choice is made. Even in silence, a direction is taken. The self, already divided, must still act as if it were whole. And in doing so, it carries the quiet burden of authorship over its life. This burden has been felt across different traditions, though expressed in different tones. In the existential reflections of Jean-Paul Sartre, freedom becomes almost overwhelming, a condition in which one is condemned to be free, unable to avoid responsibility even when one longs to. In a more spiritual register, Søren Kierkegaard speaks of anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, a kind of vertigo that arises when one realizes the openness of possibility. These voices echo what Aurelius approaches more quietly, that freedom is not simply empowering, but deeply demanding. Yet something remains unclear. If freedom is so heavy, why does Aurelius still hold it as central to a good life? The answer seems to rest in a subtle distinction. Freedom, for him, is not the endless multiplication of possibilities, but the capacity to align oneself with what is rational and just. It is not about doing anything, but about doing what ought to be done, even when no external force compels it. In this sense, freedom becomes less about expansion and more about clarity. Still, the weight does not disappear. To know what is right does not guarantee that one will do it. The inner division persists. One part of the self understands, another resists, and so freedom becomes the space in which this tension is lived out, moment by moment. There is no final resolution, no permanent state of harmony, only a series of choices, each one small, each one carrying the quiet imprint of responsibility. At the same time, this weight can begin to transform. What first appears as a burden may slowly take on a different character. Not lighter exactly, but more familiar. The constant need to choose, to answer for oneself, becomes part of the rhythm of existence. One stops searching for a place to set it down and instead learns how to carry it with a certain steadiness. And yet, even here, a question lingers. If freedom demands so much, if it exposes every weakness and removes every excuse, is it any surprise that people turn away from it, that they seek distraction, conformity, or submission to something external, simply to rest from the effort of being responsible? This movement away from freedom is rarely dramatic. It happens quietly, in small decisions, in the gradual surrender of attention. Aurelius does not condemn this tendency harshly. He observes it, perhaps even recognizes it within himself. The desire to escape responsibility is not foreign to human nature. It is part of the same divided self that seeks both virtue and ease. And so the question is not how to eliminate this desire, but how to remain aware of it without being guided by it entirely. The thought remains open, suspended between effort and retreat, between clarity and avoidance. Freedom continues to stand at the center, not as a final achievement, but as an ongoing demand, one that waits patiently in each moment, asking again, without raising its voice, what it is that one will do next. Rebellion against reason. As the weight of freedom settles more fully into awareness, another, quieter tension begins to surface, one that does not announce itself directly. If reason offers a path, clear, structured, aligned with what is good, why does the human mind so often step away from it? Not by accident, not always through ignorance, but with a strange, almost deliberate movement of refusal. In the reflections of Marcus Aurelius, this refusal is never entirely explained, yet it appears again and again, like a shadow that follows even the most disciplined thought. At first, it is tempting to see irrationality as a simple failure, a lapse in judgment, a weakness of will. But this explanation feels incomplete, because there are moments when a person understands what is reasonable, even agrees with it, and still chooses otherwise. At the same time, this choice carries a certain intensity, a subtle assertion that cannot be reduced to mere error. It is as if, in turning away from reason, something within the self is trying to affirm its independence. This leads to a deeper question. Is irrationality always a defect, or can it also be a form of resistance? Reason, especially in the Stoic sense, presents itself as universal. It asks the individual to align with a larger order, to act according to principles that transcend personal desire. There is clarity in this, and a kind of peace. Yet, something within human nature hesitates before such clarity. To follow reason completely may feel, at times, like a surrender of something more intimate, more personal. In literature, this tension has been explored with particular sharpness. The underground voice in Notes from Underground speaks precisely from this place of defiance, insisting on the right to act against reason simply to prove that one is not a mechanism, not a predictable system. There is a quiet insistence there that to be human is not only to understand, but also to disrupt, to refuse, even when refusal brings suffering. This is not a celebration of chaos, but an acknowledgement of a deeper unease with being fully governed by logic. Aurelius does not embrace this rebellion, yet he does not entirely dismiss it either. He recognizes that the mind is not a purely rational instrument. It carries impulses, emotions, and attachments that do not always submit to orderly thought. And more than that, it sometimes resists precisely because order feels imposed, even when it is self-imposed. The paradox is subtle. The very freedom that allows one to follow reason also allows one to reject it. Yet something remains unclear. If reason leads toward virtue, and virtue toward a more stable form of life, why would the self turn away from it knowingly? One possible answer lies in the complexity of identity. To act rationally is, in a sense, to become aligned with something universal. But to act irrationally, especially knowingly, can feel like an assertion of uniqueness, a way of saying, I am not only what is reasonable, I am also what exceeds it. This excess is not always destructive. Sometimes it appears in creativity, in love, in acts that cannot be fully justified by logic, yet feel deeply meaningful. At the same time, it can also lead toward harm, toward choices that fracture both the self and the world around it. The line between these two forms of irrationality is not always clear, and so the rebellion against reason remains ambiguous, neither entirely noble nor entirely flawed. Psychologically, this movement can be understood as a tension between structure and autonomy. The mind seeks coherence, yet it also seeks freedom from constraint. Even self-imposed discipline can begin to feel like a boundary that must be tested. In this sense, irrationality becomes a way of exploring the limits of the self, of pushing against the structures that define it. Aurelius, however, continues to return to reason not as a rigid system, but as a kind of quiet orientation. He does not deny the pull of resistance, but he gently redirects attention toward what endures beyond it. Still, the resistance does not disappear. It lingers, subtle and persistent, a reminder that the human being is not fully at rest within any single principle. And so the tension remains. Reason calls for alignment, for clarity, for a life shaped by understanding. Yet another voice, softer but insistent, calls for deviation, for the unpredictable, for the assertion of something that cannot be entirely explained. Between these two movements, the self continues to unfold, not in perfect harmony, but in a kind of ongoing negotiation, where even the refusal of reason becomes part of the deeper question of what it means to be human. The seed of evil within. As the quiet struggle between reason and rebellion continues to unfold, another, more unsettling recognition begins to take shape, one that does not come from abstract reflection alone, but from a closer, more personal observation. If the self is divided, if freedom places responsibility within us, and if we are capable of turning away from reason even when we understand it, then the source of harm can no longer be placed safely outside. It begins to appear nearer, less defined, and more difficult to ignore. In the thought of Marcus Aurelius, this realization does not arrive as accusation, but as a quiet and steady redirection of attention inward. It is natural, almost instinctive, to locate evil beyond oneself, in circumstances, in other people, in the structure of society. These explanations offer relief. They create distance. They allow the individual to remain, at least partially, untouched. Yet Aurelius gently resists this movement. He does not deny that external forces shape behavior, but he insists that the final act, the moment of choice, the turning of intention into action, belongs to the individual. At the same time, this insistence does not come with harsh condemnation. It comes with a kind of sober clarity. This leads to a deeper question. What does it mean to admit that the capacity for cruelty exists within oneself? Not as a dramatic confession, but as a quiet possibility that lives alongside more noble intentions. The same mind that seeks fairness can justify harm. The same voice that values truth can distort it when it becomes inconvenient. This is not a contradiction to be resolved quickly. It is a condition to be recognized slowly and without denial. In literature, this recognition often appears in its most vivid form. The characters of Fyodor Dostoevsky move through moral landscapes where the boundary between good and evil is not fixed, but fluid, shifting within the same person. And in the reflections of Hannah Arendt, the idea emerges that great harm can arise not only from monstrous intention, but from ordinary individuals who fail to examine themselves closely enough. These perspectives do not contradict Aurelius, but deepen the unease he quietly introduces. Yet something remains unclear. If evil arises from within, does this mean that human nature is fundamentally flawed? Aurelius does not go so far. He continues to believe in the possibility of reason, of alignment with what is just. But he refuses to idealize the self. Instead, he places the individual in a space of tension, where the potential for good and the potential for harm coexist, not as equal forces, but as possibilities that must be navigated. Psychologically, this recognition requires a certain kind of honesty that is not easily sustained. The mind tends to protect itself. It softens its own actions, explains them, reframes them. It prefers coherence over contradiction. And so the darker impulses often remain partially hidden, not entirely invisible, but just distant enough to avoid full confrontation. At the same time, this avoidance allows them to persist, to shape behavior in subtle ways. To look inward, then, is not simply to observe, but to encounter something that resists being seen clearly. There is discomfort here, but also a strange form of grounding, because once the source of harm is recognized as internal, the possibility of responsibility becomes more real, not abstract, not assigned, but lived. The question is no longer only why the world is as it is, but how one participates in it, even in small and almost unnoticed ways. At the same time, this recognition does not lead Aurelius into despair. He does not conclude that because harm originates within, it must inevitably dominate. Instead, he returns again and again to the practice of attention, to noticing the movement of thought before it becomes action, to creating a slight pause, a moment in which the direction of the self can shift. Still, the tension remains. The same inner space that allows for reflection also contains the seeds of distortion. The same freedom that enables goodness allows for its opposite. And so the individual stands within this quiet duality, neither fully aligned nor entirely lost, aware that the line between harm and restraint does not lie somewhere far away, but passes gently, almost imperceptibly, through the center of one's own awareness. The silent court of conscience. When the recognition of inner wrongdoing is no longer avoided, when it is allowed to remain in view without being softened or displaced, another movement begins to take shape, quieter but more persistent. It is not the immediate shock of realizing one's capacity for harm, but the slower unfolding of what follows from it. Attention settles into the mind, not sharp enough to break it, yet steady enough to remain. In the reflections of Marcus Aurelius, this tension is not described in dramatic terms, but it is always present, like a low and continuous pressure within the inner life. At first, it appears as something simple, a memory of a wrong action, a sense that something was done that should not have been done, or left undone when it should have been carried through. This is familiar. It passes through most lives without much resistance. But at the same time, when attention lingers, this simple regret begins to deepen. It does not remain tied to a single act. It expands, quietly, into a question about the self as a whole. This leads to a deeper question. Who is the one being judged within us? Because the moment guilt arises, there is already a division. One part of the mind recalls, evaluates, measures. Another part becomes the object of that evaluation. And so the inner fracture, already present, takes on a new form. It becomes a kind of silent courtroom where the self is both the one who accuses and the one who stands accused. This process is rarely loud. It does not always take the form of clear condemnation. More often, it moves in subtler ways, a slight discomfort when recalling a moment, a hesitation before repeating an action, a quiet sense that one has fallen short of something that cannot be fully defined. At the same time, this inner judgment can become more persistent, more structured, until it begins to resemble a continuous presence, a voice that does not easily fall silent. In this, the thought of Aurelius touches something that has been explored in other traditions. In the writings of Sigmund Freud, the idea of an internalized authority emerges, a force that watches, evaluates, and imposes standards upon the self. And in the spiritual reflections of Augustine of Hippo, there is the same sense of an inner witness before whom nothing can be entirely hidden. These perspectives differ in tone, yet they converge on a similar experience, that guilt is not only about what has happened, but about how the self relates to itself afterward. Yet, something remains unclear. If this inner judgment is meant to guide us toward what is better, why does it so often feel heavy, even paralyzing? Why does it not simply correct, but also burden? The answer may lie in the complexity of the standards we carry. The image of who we believe we should be is rarely simple. It is shaped by reason, by culture, by ideals that are often higher than what can be consistently lived. And so the distance between the actual self and the ideal self becomes a space of tension, one that cannot be easily closed. Aurelius does not deny this distance. He acknowledges it, though in a restrained way. He does not dwell excessively on guilt, yet he does not dismiss it. Instead, he treats it as a signal, something that calls attention to misalignment. But even here, a subtle difficulty appears, because the same awareness that allows one to correct oneself also makes one more sensitive to failure. the clearer the vision of what is right, the more visible each deviation becomes. At the same time, there is a quiet risk in this process. The inner judge, if left unchecked, can become relentless. It can move beyond guidance into accusation, beyond correction into fixation. The self begins to circle around its own shortcomings, returning to them again and again, as if repetition could resolve them. Yet it rarely does. It only deepens the sense of division, and still the movement cannot simply be stopped. To silence the inner voice entirely would be to lose something essential, a form of moral awareness that connects action to meaning. So the question becomes more delicate, not how to remove guilt, but how to remain with it, without being consumed by it, how to allow it to inform, but not to dominate. The mind continues its quiet dialogue. One part seeks understanding, another defends, another questions. The past remains present in subtle ways, shaping the tone of each new decision. And within this ongoing process, the self does not arrive at a final judgment, but remains suspended between accusation and possibility, still listening, still adjusting, as if the trial has no clear end, only a continuation that unfolds with each passing moment. Suffering as awakening. As the inner trial continues, as the voice of judgment refuses to fully quiet, another shift begins to occur, almost gently, as if the mind grows tired of resisting what it cannot avoid. The presence of discomfort, once seen as something to escape, begins to take on a different tone. It does not soften, but it becomes more visible, more understandable. In the reflections of Marcus Aurelius, suffering is not treated as an interruption of life, but as something woven into its very structure, something that, when faced directly, reveals rather than obscures. At first, this idea seems difficult to accept. Pain is immediate. Loss feels personal. Failure carries a weight that is not easily transformed into insight. And yet, at the same time, there is a quiet pattern that begins to emerge when one looks more closely. Moments of ease tend to pass without much reflection. They are lived, but not examined. It is often only when something breaks, when expectations collapse or control slips away, that attention sharpens. The mind pauses. It begins to ask questions it had previously avoided. This leads to a deeper question. What exactly does suffering reveal that comfort conceals? One answer lies in the removal of illusion. When circumstances align with desire, it is easy to believe that the world is stable, that the self is coherent, that one's direction is clear. But suffering interrupts this narrative. It exposes the fragility of what seemed secure. It reveals how much of one's identity depends on conditions that can change without warning. This exposure is not gentle, yet it carries a certain clarity. In the works of Fyodor Dostoevsky, suffering often becomes the space where characters encounter themselves most honestly, stripped of pretense. And in the reflections of Friedrich Nietzsche, there is the suggestion that hardship, though difficult, can deepen perception, forcing the individual to confront realities that comfort would allow them to ignore. These perspectives resonate with Aurelius, though he approaches them with a quieter, more restrained tone. Yet something remains unclear. If suffering reveals truth, does this mean it should be sought or welcomed without resistance? Aurelius does not go so far. He does not glorify pain, nor does he deny its difficulty. Instead, he shifts the focus. Suffering is not valuable in itself, but in how it is met. It becomes meaningful not by its presence, but by the attention brought to it, by the way it is understood and integrated into the flow of thought. Psychologically, this shift is subtle but significant. The mind tends to react to discomfort with avoidance. It looks for distraction, for explanation, for ways to reduce or reinterpret the experience. But when avoidance softens, even slightly, another possibility appears. The experience can be observed without immediate resistance. It can be allowed to unfold, to show its structure, its movement. And in this observation, something changes. The suffering does not disappear, but it becomes less opaque. At the same time, this clarity can be unsettling, because what is revealed is not only the nature of external events, but the structure of the self itself. One begins to see how deeply attached one is to certain outcomes, how strongly identity is tied to success, recognition, stability. When these are disrupted, the reaction is not only to the event, but to the perceived threat to the self. Suffering then becomes a mirror reflecting both the world and the one who perceives it. And still, the process remains incomplete. Understanding does not immediately dissolve pain. Insight does not erase loss. The tension persists, though it may take on a different quality. It becomes less about resistance and more about endurance, about remaining present within what cannot be changed. Aurelius returns again and again to this quiet endurance, not as a form of passive acceptance, but as an active engagement with reality as it is, to see clearly even when what is seen is difficult, to remain steady even when the ground feels uncertain. And within this steadiness, something begins to open, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a way of relating to suffering that does not deny it, yet does not allow it to obscure everything else, as if within the discomfort itself there is a space still forming where understanding continues to unfold. The possibility of faith. As suffering settles into a quieter form, no longer resisted with the same urgency, a different kind of question begins to rise, almost unnoticed at first. It does not come from clarity alone, nor from pain itself, but from the space that opens when both have been endured long enough. It asks, gently and without insistence, whether there is something beyond the constant tension of the self, something that does not fracture, does not accuse, does not turn away. In the reflections of Marcus Aurelius, this question does not lead directly to doctrine, but to a quieter possibility, one that resembles what might be called faith. At first, the word feels uncertain. It carries with it many meanings, some too rigid, others too distant. Yet here it appears in a more subtle form, not as belief in a defined system, but as a kind of trust, a willingness to accept that the self, divided and often unreliable, is not the only measure of reality. At the same time, this trust does not remove difficulty. It does not erase suffering or resolve inner conflict. Instead, it introduces a different orientation, one that shifts attention away from complete self-reliance. This leads to a deeper question. What does it mean to trust something beyond oneself, especially when the self is all one directly knows? The answer is not immediate. It unfolds slowly, through experience rather than argument. One begins to notice that control is never complete, that outcomes exceed intention, that the world moves according to patterns that cannot be fully grasped. In this recognition, a small opening appears, not a surrender of thought, but a softening of its boundaries. In other traditions, this movement has taken different forms. In the writings of Søren Kierkegaard, faith emerges as a leap, a movement beyond rational certainty into a relationship with what cannot be proven. In a different tone, Blaise Pascal speaks of the limits of reason and the necessity of the heart in approaching what lies beyond it. These perspectives resonate with Aurelius, though he remains more reserved, grounding his reflections in the order of nature rather than in explicit theology. Yet something remains unclear. If faith requires trust, how can trust arise in a mind that has already seen its own contradictions so clearly? The difficulty is real. The same awareness that reveals the limits of the self also makes it cautious, hesitant to commit to what cannot be fully justified. And still, there is a quiet possibility that faith does not require certainty, but only a willingness to remain open, to act as if meaning is not entirely lost, even when it cannot be fully secured. Psychologically, this movement can be understood as a shift from control to acceptance, though not in a passive sense. It is an active decision to release the demand for complete understanding. The mind does not stop questioning, but it loosens its grip on the need for final answers. At the same time, this release can feel like a risk, as if something essential is being given up. Aurelius approaches this risk with a kind of humility. He does not claim to possess ultimate knowledge. He returns instead to a trust in the rational order of the world, in the idea that there is a coherence beyond immediate perception. This trust is quiet, almost understated, yet it shapes the way he meets both suffering and choice. And still the path is not simple. To move toward faith requires a certain surrender, not of reason, but of the illusion that reason alone is sufficient. It asks the individual to accept limitation, to recognize that the self cannot fully ground itself. At the same time, it invites a transformation, subtle but profound, in how one relates to uncertainty. The tension does not disappear. Doubt remains, as does the memory of inner conflict. But alongside them, something else begins to take form, not fully defined, not entirely stable, yet present. A sense that beyond the divided self, beyond the constant negotiation of thought and will, there may be a quieter ground, one that does not demand perfection, only a willingness to continue, to trust, even without complete clarity, as the movement of thought carries gently forward. The other as responsibility. As the movement of thought begins to extend beyond the inward gaze, beyond the quiet work of examining guilt, suffering, and the fragile emergence of faith, another presence gradually comes into view. It is not abstract, not distant, but immediate and often demanding. It is the presence of other people, and with it, a new dimension of responsibility begins to unfold, one that cannot be resolved in solitude. In the reflections of Marcus Aurelius, this outward turn is not a departure from the inner life, but its necessary continuation. At first, the encounter with others appears simple. We meet, we speak, we act within shared spaces. Yet, at the same time, each encounter carries a subtle weight, because the other person is not merely part of the environment. They are, like oneself, a center of experience, a being shaped by their own struggles, their own contradictions. To recognize this is to feel a shift in perspective. The world becomes less about personal alignment alone and more about how that alignment is lived in relation to others. This leads to a deeper question. What does it mean to treat another person as a responsibility rather than as an obstacle or a tool? The answer is not immediate, because the impulse to see others in terms of their impact on us is strong. We notice how they interfere, how they frustrate, how they fail to meet expectations. Yet Aurelius gently redirects attention. He reminds himself that others act MTVKH, their own understanding, often limited, often mistaken, yet not entirely unlike his own. In this recognition, judgment begins to soften, though it does not disappear. At the same time, this shift does not make relationships easier. It may, in fact, make them more demanding. Because once the other is seen as a moral presence, indifference becomes more difficult to sustain. One cannot simply withdraw into the comfort of one's own intentions. Actions must be measured not only by internal coherence, but by their effect on others. Ethics, then, becomes something lived, not declared. In this, Aurelius resonates with later reflections, such as those of Emmanuel Levinas, who speaks of the face of the other as a call to responsibility that precedes choice. There is a similar sense that the presence of another person places a quiet demand upon us, one that cannot be entirely refused without consequence. And yet, Aurelius remains grounded in his own framework, emphasizing rational understanding and shared humanity as the basis for this responsibility. Yet something remains unclear. If each person is struggling within their own inner divisions, their own tendencies toward error, how can one maintain patience without becoming passive? How can one respond to harm without reproducing it? The tension here is subtle and ongoing. Compassion must not become indulgence. Justice must not become cruelty. And between these, the individual must find a way to act. Psychologically, this requires a delicate balance. The mind must hold awareness of its own flaws while remaining open to the flaws of others. It must resist the urge to elevate itself through judgment, while also refusing to ignore what is harmful. This is not a stable position. It shifts with each interaction, each moment of misunderstanding or connection. Aurelius returns, again and again, to the idea that humans are made for cooperation, that to act against one another is to act against one's own nature. Yet this belief is not naive. He knows how often people fail to live up to it. And still, he chooses to orient himself toward patience, toward restraint, toward a kind of steady goodwill that does not depend on reciprocity. At the same time, this orientation reveals another layer of responsibility. It is not only about how one treats others, but about how one understands them, to assume ignorance rather than malice, to allow space for imperfection. And yet, this too has its limits, which are not always clear. And so the encounter with the other becomes a continuation of the inner work, but now made visible, tested in action. The self, once examined in solitude, now unfolds in relation, where every gesture carries meaning, and every response shapes the space between people, as if the question of how to live is no longer confined within, but moves quietly outward, asking again, in each meeting, what it means to be responsible. The seduction of ideology. As the attention widens from the immediacy of human relationships to the broader patterns that shape them, another force begins to emerge, less visible at first, yet deeply influential. It does not appear in a single person nor in a single act, but in the shared frameworks through which people understand the world. These frameworks promise clarity. They offer direction. They gather individuals into a common language of meaning. And yet, in the reflections of Marcus Aurelius, there is a quiet caution toward anything that claims too much certainty, too quickly. At first, ideology feels like relief. It simplifies. It reduces the complexity of the world into coherent patterns, into explanations that can be held without constant doubt. In a life already marked by inner division, by uncertainty and moral tension, this clarity can feel like a kind of rest. One no longer needs to question every impulse or examine every contradiction. The system provides answers in advance. At the same time, this leads to a deeper question. What is lost when complexity is replaced by certainty? The answer is not immediate because the loss is subtle. It does not announce itself as absence, but as narrowing. The individual begins to see less, even while believing they understand more. Nuance fades, ambiguity becomes uncomfortable, and gradually the living reality of human experience is reshaped to fit the structure of the idea. Aurelius does not speak in the language of ideology as it is known today, yet his concern is clear. Any belief that overrides direct perception, that replaces careful judgment with fixed conclusions, risks separating the individual from what is real. The danger is not only intellectual, it becomes moral. Because once a system defines what is right and wrong with absolute clarity, it also defines who belongs and who does not. And in this division, the possibility of cruelty quietly enters. In the works of George Orwell, this transformation is made visible in stark terms, where language itself becomes shaped by ideology, narrowing thought until alternative perspectives can no longer be expressed. And in the reflections of Hannah Arendt, there is a recognition that large-scale harm often arises not from chaotic impulses, but from rigid systems that justify actions through abstract necessity. These insights echo what Aurelius approaches from within, that the loss of inner examination can extend outward into collective blindness. Yet something remains unclear. If ideologies are so dangerous, why are they so compelling? The answer may lie in the very tensions already encountered. The divided self seeks coherence. The burden of freedom seeks relief. The weight of responsibility seeks something to lean on. Ideology offers all of these at once. It provides a sense of belonging, a structure for action, and a justification that quiets doubt. It does not remove inner conflict, but it redirects it outward. Psychologically, this movement can be understood as a displacement. The struggles within the individual are projected onto the world. What is uncertain inside becomes certain outside. What is conflicted within becomes simplified into opposition. And so, the inner division, instead of being lived and examined, becomes externalized, often in ways that intensify rather than resolve it. At the same time, Aurelius continues to return to a quieter path. He emphasizes attention over abstraction, the careful examination of one's own thoughts rather than adherence to rigid systems. This does not mean withdrawing from society, but engaging with it without surrendering one's capacity for reflection. It requires a certain vigilance, a willingness to remain uncertain where certainty would be more comfortable. And still, the tension does not disappear. The desire for clarity remains strong. The pull of collective belief continues to shape perception. Between the need for understanding and the risk of simplification, the mind moves carefully, aware that the same impulse that seeks truth can, if left unchecked, transform it into something rigid, something that no longer sees, but only asserts, as if the question of how to live together has now expanded beyond the individual into the fragile and shifting space where many minds converge, and where the line between insight and illusion becomes increasingly difficult to trace. Becoming through ruin. After the long passage through inner division, through the weight of freedom and the quiet persistence of guilt, through suffering, faith, and the fragile encounter with others and the world they formed together, something remains. Not a conclusion, not a clear resolution, but a kind of open ground. It is here, in this unsettled space, that the thought of Marcus Aurelius becomes most difficult to hold, and perhaps most honest, because what remains is not certainty, but the possibility of becoming. At first, this possibility does not appear as something hopeful. It feels uncertain, even exposed. To become means that what one is now is not fixed. It means that the self, already seen as divided and unstable, must continue to change without any guarantee of final coherence. At the same time, there is a quiet recognition that nothing else is available. The idea of a completed self, free from contradiction and tension, begins to fade. What takes its place is a more demanding vision. That meaning is not something discovered once and held, but something shaped slowly through repeated encounters with difficulty. This leads to a deeper question. What does it mean to form oneself through ruin? The word may seem too strong, yet it reflects something essential. Each moment of failure, each recognition of one's own limitation, each collapse of certainty, these are not only losses, they are also points at which the previous image of the self can no longer be maintained. Something breaks, and in that breaking there is space, though it may not feel like it at first. In the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, there is the suggestion that one must become who one is through a process that includes destruction as well as creation. And in the quieter reflections of Rainer Maria Rilke, there is a similar patience, a willingness to let questions remain, to allow transformation to unfold without forcing it into clarity too soon. These voices echo in different tones what Aurelius approaches with restraint, that the self is not refined by avoiding difficulty, but by passing through it. Yet something remains unclear. If transformation depends on struggle, how can one avoid becoming hardened by it? How can suffering open rather than close the self? The answer is not given directly. It seems to depend on a subtle orientation, a way of meeting experience that does not collapse into bitterness or denial. This is not a fixed skill, but a continuous effort, one that must be renewed in each moment. Psychologically, this process involves a shift from resistance to engagement. The mind no longer seeks to eliminate contradiction entirely, but learns to remain with it, to observe it without immediate judgment. This does not remove pain, but it changes its role. What was once purely disruptive becomes, slowly, informative. The self begins to see its own patterns more clearly, not as abstract ideas, but as lived tendencies. At the same time, the question of identity becomes less rigid. Instead of asking who one is in a final sense, the question becomes more fluid, more immediate. Who am I becoming in this action, in this response, in this moment of choice? And beneath this, another question remains, quieter but more persistent. Not what is the perfect version of the self, but what direction is being taken again and again through small decisions that accumulate over time. Aurelius does not promise that this process leads to peace in any simple way. The tensions remain. The inner division does not disappear. The world continues to resist full understanding. And yet, within this ongoing movement, there is a possibility that did not exist at the beginning. Not certainty, but a kind of alignment that is lived rather than declared. At the same time, this alignment is fragile. It depends on attention, on honesty, on a willingness to see what one might prefer to avoid. It cannot be secured once and for all. It must be formed and reformed in the presence of everything that challenges it. And so the journey does not end in an answer, but in a question that returns, gently, without urgency. Given all that has been seen, the division, the freedom, the capacity for harm, the weight of responsibility, the pull of illusion, what is one willing to become now, in the quiet space of the next moment, where nothing is yet fixed and where the shape of the self continues to emerge, slowly, almost imperceptibly, from within the very tensions that once seemed only to divide it?